everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite character in A Storm of Swords and why it is Jaime Lannister. Now, I did go back and forth about this a little bit. I mean, there are small distinctions here and there. I think on certain days I might be convinced Tyrion is my favorite character in this book. But this time, after this last reread, I'm pretty convinced it's Jaime Lannister, so I'm going with that answer. And I want to go ahead and say a few things first. One is that this will be mostly on A Storm of Swords. There will be spoilers. And this will by no means be the most comprehensive video on Jaime Lannister, so I invite you to share your thoughts in the comment section below. But I do want to bring up a question that came up for me on this reread about Jaime Lannister, which is Jaime Lannister, redemption arc or reveal arc, or both? And another thing to bring up is that when I read this book the first time many years ago, I very distinctly remember having the thought, I know what you're doing, Martin. I know you're trying to get me to forget that this is the same character that pushed Bran out the window in book one. I am not forgetting that. And so I think I was in some ways, or maybe a lot of ways, kind of feeling like Brienne does in this story. Very, very resistant to seeing the good in this character. Even though I'm going to focus on A Storm of Swords, I do think it's important to bring some context going into this book. So this is the first book where we get Jaime's perspective, where we get chapters from his point of view. However, we have a lot of ideas about this character prior to this book, both good and bad, and mostly bad, especially the one point I brought up already, which is that he pushes Bran out the window in book one, thus crippling Bran. And so that's an important point. He's also caught, obviously the reason he does that is because he's having this incestuous relationship with Cersei, his sister. Gross. And we do know, of course, that Cersei's kids that he's actually the father of Cersei's kids, not Robert. And he's also seen as the Kingslayer, and being a Kingslayer is not seen as an honorable thing by the many perspectives we follow leading up to book 3. Another thing, though, is that he attacks Ned in King's Landing in book 1. I think that's an interesting point to make, or an interesting point to make about that is, one, he does so because he knows Catelyn is holding his brother Tyrion as captive. And I think it's interesting because we do see through that perspective, well, in other ways too, he does care about Tyrion, and we care about Tyrion, so it makes it complicated from that point of view. Other ways that I think things are complicated or made complicated in our perspective of Jaime prior to A Storm of Swords is the incredible dialogue between Jaime and Catelyn in A Clash of Kings, where we learn a few things from his perspective in his snarky attitude about all the vows they make you swear in order to become a knight, maybe specifically of the Kingsguard. And also how crazy King Aerys was, and the way that he witnessed Brandon and Rickard Stark's deaths, that was horrific. So just the craziness he had to witness even then, and the fact that Ned scowls at Jaime when Jaime is sitting on the throne when Ned walks in. I think, and this comes up a couple of times in A Storm of Swords, what I'm guessing about him being so upset about Ned Stark judging him is the fact that would Ned have had to kill Aerys if Jaime didn't? So that's something that could be questioned. And the other thing too that we also learn about in A Clash of Kings is after doing all that for Robert to step up to the throne, guess what? Jaime has to kneel and ask for forgiveness. You can kind of start to see how Martin is affecting our perspective even prior to this book. But in this book, I would say that still the scales are tipped slightly against Jaime, including the fact that Jaime is seen as on the opposing side of Robb Stark. And I think that we as readers are in some ways made to have more sympathy for Robb than for the Lannisters. And plus, even that whole dialogue exchange between Catelyn and Jaime, we're also in A Clash of Kings made to have a lot more sympathy for Catelyn because her father had just died. She's living with this idea that her 2 youngest sons are dead. So, I mean, there's a lot weighing on her at that time. So it's like seeing from her perspective how vile and horrible she sees Jaime is probably also affecting us in some ways. So I think that's all important to point out. Now getting into A Storm of Swords, I promise I want to mostly talk about this book. When Brienne is throwing boulders on these men who are chasing them down and men are drowning, Jamie's laughing. He's constantly laughing when things seem like they shouldn't be a joke. Jamie is laughing about them. He seems to have the darkest sense of humor ever, and that really stood out. He's also making a lot of sexist remarks towards Brienne. He accuses her of killing Renly and then says, "Were you on your moon's blood?" and calls her a stupid wench, or in his mind comments constantly about how ugly she is. But there are some interesting shifts that start to occur. So now to get into redemption versus reveal, I'm going to go into reveal first. So the reveal arcs are really interesting in this. And as we saw, there are already some reveals that happen in A Clash of Kings. But I think that it was really interesting to see how his whole story began. So Jaime was knighted as young as 16 because he wants to be close to Cersei against Tywin's wishes for him to produce an heir. He'd rather be closer to his sister and not have to worry about marrying Lisa Tully. We learn a few things about Aerys. We learn that he wants to keep Jaime close because he doesn't trust Tywin. And Tywin is trying to wait and see who the winning side is. So he decides to wait and side with Baratheon after the Trident battle when it seems like the tide is shifting that direction. And then when Aerys instructs Jaime to kill his father, I mean, what are you going to choose? But also, we learn that Jaime is also the hero of Westeros because, of course, Aerys has planted wildfire everywhere. So Jaime kills the messenger. He kills Aerys before all that takes place. It's crazy just to think about all the good that Jaime did in a way, helping out his father, saving Westeros from wildfire. We also find out that just what the white signifies to him. I know he tells Brienne that it was the white that soiled him, not the other way around. Now, there are a couple of times in this particular story where we find out that he was actually wearing his gold cloak instead of his white cloak when he killed Aerys. And that seems significant in both instances it's brought up. I think, and I suspect, and I might be wrong about this, but I suspect that maybe the idea here is that if he were the cold-blooded Kingslayer people make him out to be, he would have been wearing the white. It would have been even more dishonorable. But the fact is he was wearing his true colors. He was revealing himself prior to killing Aerys. So I think that that's part of what that was about. The gold armor, not the white. But no one ever remembers that. Would that I have taken off that cloak as well. So why was it important for people to remember that? So I think that that had significance. And nobody knows that because as a Kingsguard person, you're sworn to secrecy about things. So it's not like he's going to go and boast about it. Now, there were a couple of interesting reveals that happened in this particular book. One was the attack in King's Landing of Ned and Ned's men, the one that left Ned injured and having to stay in King's Landing. And so one thing is that, of course, like I said before, Jaime was doing this because of Tyrion being held captive by Catelyn. But we later learn that when that whole thing took place, part of what was actually happening is that Tywin was going to be killing Ned if Ned went and left King's Landing. But that news never got to Jaime in time. And so Jaime, by attacking Ned, it actually might have saved Ned. Oddly, it could have been a consequence, perhaps. Of course, that Ned ended up dying anyway. Maybe it turned out worse for Ned. Who knows the way things turned out. But you know, it's hard to know. But it was an interesting point that came up. But the other reveal that I thought was more interesting than anything in this book was about the laugh, at least from my perspective. I think this was the particular passage that made me reframe what I thought about Jaime's laugh. One day he heard Urswick say something about Harrenhal and remembered that was to be their destination. That made him laugh aloud, and that made Timian slash his face with a long, thin whip. The cut bled, but beside his hand he scarcely felt it. And of course this is after his hand has been chopped off. "Why did you laugh?" the wench asked him that night in a whisper. "Harrenhal was where they gave me the white cloak," he whispered. "Whence great tourney. He wanted to show us all his big castle and his fine sons. I wanted to show them too. I was only 15, but no one could have beaten me that day. Aerys never let me joust." He laughed again. "He sent me away, but now I'm coming back." Now that passage does add an interesting layer of backstory. It also makes me think about what it would have been like to have Aerys hovering over you as a 15-year-old boy. I just think there's a lot there probably, but also that particular passage there was the moment when I reframed the way I thought about Jamie's laugh. Now, I think it could be clear to many readers that the laugh is a defense, like a defense mechanism. Like I'm going to laugh about this and nobody can get to me, nobody can hurt me because I'm laughing, kind of thing. I could see that. However, when I read this particular passage, I saw it maybe a step deeper than that. I saw it as maybe every time he's laughing, he's actually deep down masking pain. It's almost like a reaction that comes out of him to mask internal pain that he's feeling. And I don't know why, like, that became more clear to me this time than before, rather than just a defense. I was talking about this with my husband. He said that this is what is called incongruent behavior or incongruent mannerisms, however you want to call it. But it's basically like when your behaviors or your manners are incongruent with what you're actually feeling. So it's kind of like if I were feeling really happy and I'm frowning the whole time, or something like that. Two behaviors that are incongruent, that don't match up with one another, and that send mixed messages to the person who's observing you or interacting with you. So that seems to be the case here with Jamie's laugh. I suddenly just saw it in a totally different way. Like I said, there are different levels, I think, of seeing the laugh. Like you could see it as just like, oh, that guy's just a jerk, you know, or he's a psycho or whatever. Or there could be a level of like, that's a defense. But to see it as maybe his response to pain and him dealing with pain was what I thought was an interesting reveal. I think I even learned in The Clash of Kings, there was a part where he said that whenever he saw Ares do these trials with people that were awful, that were just pure torture, he would, in his mind, try to think about Cersei. So he had built for himself a way of withdrawing, of compartmentalizing whenever he's in these situations, to think about other things. And he seems to bring this to Brienne when Brienne is about to get raped, and he tells her, he said, let them do it. Think about Renly. And it sounds kind of snarky and mean to say that, but he really, I think, sincerely is trying to help her out. He's like, try to think of something else. Go somewhere else in your mind, because that's what he does. That's what he has done to get by whenever he's struggled. He's tried to think about Cersei. Cersei has been his coping mechanism. And there's even a part where he says that he tries to think about Cersei when he closes his eyes. He wants to dream about her after getting his hand cut off. And instead he sees Ares, you know, and he goes back there. And it's like he has to face his past this whole entire book. So redemption arc, I think that's actually part of the redemption arc here, is him having to witness his past, him having to relive it, him having to reprocess the things that happened to him. And I say redemption, I don't know. I mean, obviously he pushes Bran out the window. He does some horrible things. Just because he has a bad past doesn't make it okay for him to have done that. We do see him start to shift in a different direction. Yes, the past happened. Yes, the past was horrible. He might have been a hero in some sense of saving Westeros. Nobody acknowledged it. He could choose to go on the rest of his life being a bitter, angry, incestuous knight. And yet he starts to make some different choices along the way. And that's part of the brilliance of being put together with Brienne, is that Brienne is such an honorable person. And through Brienne, he starts to cooperate. And yes, he's against her at first. And yes, he has a brawl with her. But I think that the way he sort of redeems himself in the reader's eyes, in addition to, of course, the reveal story could be seen as its own redemption. But I think that the way he starts to redeem himself in the reader's eyes are the ways in which he starts to acknowledge the good parts of Brienne. I think he can't help but acknowledge that there is something to be admired about how she really believes in the honor she's doing, in her vows, in her oath to Catelyn Stark. And he really admires her strength and her determination and her resolve. So there are many things about Brienne he starts to acknowledge and admire, and in that way soften the way we see him in our eyes. Plus the way that, as I mentioned before, that he helps her, but he lets her in too. So, I mean, he tries to help her by offering, obviously, that advice, the unsolicited advice of just let them do it and think about Renly. But, you know, he also saves her by calling out sapphires and that whole thing, and pointing out that a more honorable man might have just not lied and let things happen to her. But also, he takes in what she says. He lets himself be influenced by her. He lets himself be influenced by her when she tells him, don't be craven. Don't let them win, basically. Don't give up. You need to live. You need to live for those you love. You need to live to have vengeance on your enemies. And he takes that to heart. Craven, Jaime thought, as Brienne fought to stifle her moans. Can it be? They took my sword hand. Was that all I was? A sword hand? Gods be good, is it true? The wench had the right of it. He could not die. Cersei was waiting for him. She would have need of him, and Tyrion, his little brother, who loved him for a lie, and his enemies were waiting too. He feels that struggle with embracing a new identity without his sword hand. Who is he if he doesn't have that sword hand anymore? The one that defined him in so many ways, but also just recognizing how Tyrion, his little brother who loved him for a lie, and it could be a little mysterious what lie he's talking about until maybe the end of the book when he reveals the true story to Tyrion about Taisha. Obviously, he feels remorse for that. I think that's an important point to mention. And he admits it to Tyrion at the end and frees Tyrion, by the way. So that's another way that he might be seen as redeemed in our minds, only to receive a false confession from Tyrion. And for Tyrion to kill their father, but that aside. As part of a redemption arc, I think part of that is also the sympathy that he elicits in us whenever he goes through the torture of having his hand cut off, the same hand that kills Aerys, the same hand that made him a Kingslayer and that made him a knight. He ends up getting that cut off. He screams, he can't help it. The way that he's completely knocked down, along with Brienne. The way that they're forced to ride on a horse together, facing one another with a cut off hand between them. It's disgusting. And there's also this line, then he made his eyes go dry and his heart go dead and prayed for his fever to burn away his tears. Now I know how Tyrion felt all those times they laughed at him. So I think it's interesting, by the way, to laugh again, because that was his defense. And maybe that was also what comes up for him when he's in pain. But he also recognizes how that hurts, how that hurt Tyrion as well. Even though I mentioned that he helps Brienne earlier, he saves her as well. I think it's clear that Jaime is trying. He starts to try to show that he doesn't have to continue to be bitter, that he can have some agency. And I think that that's also seen later on when he gives Oathkeeper to Brienne, honors the oath he made with Catelyn Stark, honors Brienne and what Brienne is set out to do, and even defends her to Loras. He sees himself in Loras too, the old self. I thought that was a really interesting point. But also when he opens the white book and he realizes that he can write whatever he wants now, that he could shape his future how he wants to. And also, I think I should also mention the fact that he has that last difficult exchange with his father. What a horrible last conversation to have with your father before your father dies, when he says, you are not my son. But, he says he needs to do his duty as part of the King's Guard. Of course, part of that is that he doesn't want to leave Cersei again. And he was honorable to Cersei. That's the other part too. Even though it's gross, the incest thing, I mean, there's something to be said about the fact that he denies Pia at Harrenhal, and he ends up saying that he only has one woman in mind. There's only one woman for him, and that's Cersei, despite the fact that he later finds out Cersei wasn't quite so true to him. So it's interesting. I mean, there are a lot more things that I could say about Jaime. I think the fact that he really does seem to care about Brienne over time. I think the bathhouse scene was pretty powerful. The fact that he tells Brienne this whole story, and afterwards when he starts to faint from the fever and she calls out, guards, the Kingslayer, and he says, Jaime, my name is Jaime. There's something so painful about that, about him really wanting to be seen for the true self he is. I think she does see it, but it's hard for her still. It's still hard for her to see past her own biases. And so it's interesting just to see all this. I know this isn't the final thing I could say about Jaime. There's probably a lot more I'm missing in this conversation. But I just wanted to add just how complex it is and come back to that same question I have at the beginning. Redemption arc or reveal arc or both? And I think it's both. I think they both actually blend together in a lot of ways too. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below, your thoughts on Jaime Lannister. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.